Before we dive into this powerful story of injustice, redemption, and resilience, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Smash the like button if you believe in equality for our land. Subscribe for more real-life stories that move hearts and change minds. Now, let me take you to a lonely stretch of highway in Georgia, where everything changed with a single phone call. The sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked two-lane highway cutting through Pinewood County, Georgia, town where time seemed to have stalled somewhere between history and hesitation. It was the kind of place where folks still waved at each other from pickup trucks, where the local diner doubled as town hall, and where outsiders were noticed and remembered. General Vivian Hale kept her eyes on the road, the soft hum of her luxury sedan whispering through the silence. She wasn't used to this kind of quiet naught. After decades of intelligence briefings, encrypted calls, and global strategy sessions, this was different. This was personal. Her mother was dying, the woman who'd raised her on faith, grit, and books from the back of the church library. The woman who taught her to stand tall even when others tried to make her feel small. General Hale wasn't just going home, she was going back to her roots. But in Pinewood County, the roots ran deeper than she remembered, and not all of them were welcoming. She had just passed a faded road sign that read Pinewood, population 4,319, when the flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. At first, she thought nothing of it. She had her seatbelt on, wasn't speeding, and had passed no obvious signage. She pulled over, engine idling, waiting calmly as the officer approached. She lowered her window, license and registration. The officer barked, his sunglasses hiding his eyes. Vivian turned and offered a polite, firm smile. "Certainly, officer. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "No questions. Just hand me the license and registration," he snapped. His tone wasn't unfamiliar. She'd heard it before decades ago. In Savannah, she'd heard it on her father's lips when he warned her about the world outside their neighborhood, and she'd heard it in briefings on implicit bias and conflict escalation. But here it was, again raw and unfiltered. She complied without another word. The officer glanced at her ID, then did a double take. His jaw tightened. "Military, huh?" he said, as if the word left a sour taste in his mouth. "You got any weapons in this vehicle?" "General," she saw the way he emphasized the title, mocking, incredulous. She had encountered these types before, but usually not in uniform, not with power, not with a badge. "No weapons, sir," she said calmly. "Just a suitcase and my mother's medication. I'm heading to Savannah." But he wasn't listening. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Her heart sank. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I said step out of the vehicle." On the hot asphalt, her boots clicked with the precision of someone used to standing in front of foreign dignitaries and briefing the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yet here she stood, Tres Star General Bibian, Ali, arms spread against the hood of her car, while a white local officer searched her vehicle. Without cause, the handcuffs clicked too tightly around her wrists, and as she stood there decorated, humiliated, she couldn't help but remember her father, Sergeant Leonard Hale, Vietnam veteran, Bronze Star, treated like a criminal after serving the very country that now questioned his daughter. The irony wasn't lost on her. "You matched a description." The officer grunted. "A description," she repeated, struggling to remain composed. "Of what, exactly?" "Suspicious vehicle, out-of-state tags, driving too slow through town." It was nonsense. It was profiling. It was a story she'd heard before, only this time she was the one living it. "I suggest you call this number," she said, her voice unwavering. She recited a direct Pentagon emergency contact line, the one used for national security breaches and urgent military protocols, the one that would either shock him or expose him. The officer scoffed, but he dialed, and that's when everything changed. The phone call was still ringing when Deputy Mitchell's expression started to shift. She hadn't expected the number to be real, much less active. Her fingers fumbled slightly as she held the phone closer, pressing it to her ear. "Yes, I have someone claiming to be Lieutenant General Vivian Hale," she repeated awkwardly. There was a pause on the other end. Then came the voice, firm, calm, absolute. "This is General Brennan, Deputy Director of Operations at the Pentagon. You will release General Hale immediately. Her credentials are not only authentic, they're classified at a level far beyond your clearance. You are currently in violation of federal protocol. Expect a follow-up from Internal Affairs and our legal department. Do you understand?" Deputy Mitchell stammered a reply, but General Hale had already begun to shift upright. The hot asphalt had scorched the back of her hands, but her eyes remained cool, sharp, and unreadable. She said nothing as the cuffs were removed, not a word as the officer backed away, face drained of color. But inside, a storm was rising, not of anger, but of clarity. The uniform she wore, the stars on her shoulders, were not just symbols of achievement. They were armor she'd forged in silence, pain, and perseverance, and they told a story, one that didn't begin on that roadside, one that had started far earlier, in places where neither law nor logic had protected her, but dignity had, years before she'd ever stood before flags and cameras, before she'd been saluted in airfields across the world. Vivian Hale was just a girl in a small, forgotten part of Savannah where sidewalks cracked like old promises, and playgrounds doubled as battlegrounds for broken dreams. She remembered the afternoon her fourth-grade teacher, Mrs. Thorne, pulled her aside after class. The woman's soft voice carried an unusual gravity that day. "Vivian, do you know what potential means?" Vivian had blinked, unsure. "It means you see the world a little clearer than others your age," Mrs. Thorne said. "It means you'll be tempted to shrink yourself so others feel comfortable. Don't. It's not your job to fit into small places." That single sentence stayed with her longer than most of her textbooks. At home, her mother worked 2 jobs: cafeteria cook by day, church custodian by night. Her father had worked in sanitation and never complained, even when his knees gave out in his 40s. They owned no luxuries, but they held wealth in discipline, pride, and faith. Not the kind preached from pulpits, but the quiet kind that shows up on time, does what's right, and lifts others without waiting for applause. It was during those years that Vivian learned how the world measured people like her not by dreams, but by zip codes, skin tone, and the decibel of their silence. So, she decided early on, she wouldn't be loud, she'd be undeniable. She read everything she could find, books on science, biographies, articles left in staff lounges. If the library opened at 8, she arrived by 7:30. She was the first to sign up for school elections, science fairs, debate teams, and public speaking competitions, not to be seen, but to prepare. She believed that power was quiet, and often mistaken for humility. In high school, while her friends made prom plans and joked about senior pranks, Vivian was studying SAT flashcards during lunch. She applied to West Point, not because someone told her to, but because no one ever had. It felt like claiming something that had always belonged to someone else and asking why not her. Her acceptance letter arrived 3 weeks after her father passed. It was the last thing he touched, his fingerprint still visible in the corner of the envelope where he'd paused, trembling, before opening it. West Point was a furnace of challenge. It wasn't just the long runs at dawn or the relentless memorization of protocol, it was the subtle exclusions, the study group invitations that never came, the praise others received for the same answer she'd given moments before. There were no outright slurs, just the exhausting burden of being exceptional without room for error. But Vivian had trained for that her whole life. One professor, Colonel Ramirez, noticed her precision, her self-discipline, her almost surgical attention to every detail. "Cadet Hale," he once told her, "you don't raise your voice, you raise the bar." She graduated top of her unit in strategy and logistics, earning a commission that took her first to the sands of Kuwait, then the mountains of Afghanistan, where she became known as the commander who walked supply routes on foot to understand every angle of risk. In a remote outpost near Kandahar, she once led a convoy through treacherous terrain, rerouting the mission based on instinct and intercepted radio chatter. That decision saved 28 lives. Later that night, while cleaning her boots in silence, she overheard a junior officer say, "She's not just good for a woman, she's just good." It was the closest thing to recognition she'd ever expected, but her most difficult battle had nothing to do with desserts or drones. It was when she returned home one Christmas and found her mother sitting quietly by the window, medical bills piled like snowdrifts on the table. The VA support had been slow, too slow. Vivian used her personal savings to cover everything. She did it without a word. Her mother never asked. She never had to dot at the Pentagon. She became a myth among younger officers, the strategist who could read a battlefield like a book, the woman who briefed presidents without ever using a single bullet point. She was offered promotion after promotion, but always stayed grounded, in the people, in the purpose. Yet, even with stars on her shoulders, moments like the one in Pinewood County proved something she'd never forgotten. Medals don't erase injustice, but character can challenge it. And stories like hers weren't about revenge. They were about resolve. That night, as she sat in her hotel room just outside of Savannah, she didn't file a complaint. She didn't call the press. She called her mother. Elaine Hale's voice, though faint, still had that fire. "Did you make it in one piece, baby?" Vivian paused, then smiled. "Almost," she said, "but I'm here now, and I've got some stories to tell you." They talked for hours, about old neighbors, about peach pie, about the way the world was still spinning, even when it should have stopped to catch its breath. Vivian never mentioned the arrest, not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't define her. And the next day, when she walked into the hospital room in full uniform, her mother's eyes welled up not from sadness, but from pride so heavy it could have filled the whole room. "Look at you," she whispered, "still holding your head high." Vivian leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently. "I learned from the best," she said, and for the first time in a long while, both of them sat in silence, not the kind that aches, but the kind that heals. The hospital room buzzed, softly minarets blinking, distant intercoms crackling through the halls, but within those four walls, time slowed. Vivian sat beside her mother's bed, fingers wrapped gently around the fragile hand that had once braided her hair before school, corrected her grammar mid-sentence, and held her through every scraped knee and heartbreak. Elaine's breath was shallow now, her body small beneath the blanket, but her eyes were still bright, watchful, proud. "I always knew you'd wear stars one day," she whispered, a soft smile tracing her lips. "Just never thought they'd be on your shoulders instead of the sky." Vivian chuckled gently, blinking back something more than just tiredness. "You gave me the sky, Mama." Outside, Savannah's late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds in golden slats. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. That sound pulled Vivian backward through time, back to childhood Sundays, ironed dresses, and holding her mother's hand walking up church steps. Faith had been a quiet thing in their home, not loud, not boastful, just woven into everything, like threads in a quilt. As her mother dozed, Vivian stepped into the hallway, needing air. The events of the past 48 hours hung in the back of her mind, rested, humiliated, dismissed by someone who hadn't bothered to ask for her name, much less her story. She hadn't told Elaine. Not yet. Maybe she never would. But outside that hospital room, the world hadn't stayed silent. Unbeknownst to her, a bystander from Pinewood County, an elderly schoolteacher named Marlene Peters, had quietly filmed the entire roadside incident from across the street. She hadn't meant to share it, but when she recognized the name Vivian Hale and did a quick search, what she found astonished her. "She's a general," Marlene had whispered to her granddaughter. "A real one, I think. I think the world needs to see this." By the next morning, the video had surfaced first on a niche military forum, then on a growing thread on social media titled simply, #salute her right. People watched, then watched again. A woman in uniform, calm, composed, respectful, being pressed against her own vehicle by someone half her age and none of her experience. Questions bloomed like wildfire. Who was she? Why did this happen? And how often did stories like hers vanish without names, without cameras? By the time Vivian returned to her hotel that evening, her name was trending. Pentagon officials had already reached out, politely urging her to remain discreet. There was talk of internal reviews, protocol reassessments, and quiet conversations behind closed doors, but that wasn't what caught her attention. What did were the thousands of messages flooding her inbox, from cadets, from young black girls who'd never seen someone who looked like them wear 3 stars, from retired generals who admitted, in private, that even they had once been mistaken for less than they were, from mothers, grandfathers, teachers, young men, old men, and women across the world who wrote, "I didn't know your name yesterday. I'll never forget it now." She read them in silence, each one a reminder of what her story had become, a mirror, not of tragedy, of endurance, of what happens when dignity doesn't flinch on, when justice does. The next morning, she visited her childhood church. The pews were smaller than she remembered, the pulpit lower, but the people were still there. They rose when she walked in, not out of obligation, but awe. Some had babysat her, others had been her Sunday school teachers, They greeted her like family returning from war. During the service, the pastor, Reverend Lyle, now in his 70s, gestured toward her from the pulpit. "Sometimes," he said, "God sends us someone who doesn't just survive the fire but becomes the light others follow out of it." Vivian smiled humbly, folding her hands. She didn't need applause. She never had. But what happened next would shift everything. As she stepped outside after the service, a woman in plain clothes approached her. "General Hale," she said, holding up a badge. "I'm with the Inspector General's office. We need to speak with you off the record, for now, about Pinewood County." Vivian tilted her head. "I didn't file a report." "I know," the woman said, "but someone did, and your story, it's already changing things. The Justice Department is watching, quietly, and they're listening to you now, whether you speak or not." Vivian looked past the woman toward the horizon, the same streets where she once walked to school, where she'd seen her father dragged from a car for the color of his skin. Now, decades later, the cycle had tried to repeat, but met a different ending. She hadn't fought back with rage. She didn't have to. Her story had done the speaking. Later that night, in her hotel, she finally pulled out a worn leather-bound journal. It had been a gift from her mother on the day she left for West Point. On the first page were 3 words, written in her mother's looping script: "Write your worth." Vivian flipped to a fresh page and picked up her pen, not because she needed to remember what happened, but because the world clearly had. And as her pen moved across the page, quiet, steady, resolute, one thing became clear. This was no longer just her story. It belonged to everyone who'd ever been underestimated. To everyone who'd ever been mistaken for less than they were. To everyone who knew that silence could carry more strength. Then shouts, and that the greatest power is not in forcing people to see you, but in becoming impossible to ignore. The morning air in Savannah carried a heaviness that felt almost spiritual. There was a stillness in the clouds, a hush in the wind, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Vivian stood outside her childhood home, an aging but dignified brick house with creaky shutters and a magnolia tree that had once been the tallest thing she'd ever climbed. Her suitcase sat at her feet, untouched. Inside, her mother was resting, perhaps for the last time. Vivian had seen loss before. She had buried friends, saluted caskets, stood in silent honor beside flag-draped coffins under sun and snow. But this felt different. This wasn't the battlefield. This was the root. Her roots. And something inside her told her that, if she didn't act now, if she didn't do something lasting, then everything she'd endured, everything her mother had sacrificed, would dissolve into another moment forgotten too soon. That's when the letter arrived. It wasn't from the Pentagon, not officially. It had no seal, no formal header, just a manila envelope slid quietly under the door by a stranger who disappeared before she could thank him. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned, a transcript. It documented not just her stop in Pinewood County, but a pattern. 10 stops, 7 wrongful arrests, 4 formal complaints, 1 suicide. An Iraq War veteran named Leonard Gaines, who had been detained after a broken taillight escalated into a violent confrontation. His PTSD, untreated. His cries, ignored. His record, spotless. Until that night, Vivian sat on the porch steps, heart thudding, reading every word. It wasn't just about her anymore. Someone wanted her to see the bigger picture. And now she had. But the question still hung in the air like thunder waiting to crack the sky. What would she do with it? Her first instinct was silence. She had built her entire life on quiet power leading, without demanding attention. Rising through performance, not protest. But something in her mother's eyes, in her weakening voice the night before, had planted a seed. Vivi, Elaine, had whispered, reaching for her hand. "Promise me something. Don't just walk away from this one. You've done enough saluting." It's time the world saluted back. Vivian hadn't responded in that moment. She couldn't. The weight was too fresh. But now, with that envelope in her lap and the weight of untold stories hanging in the air, she knew her silence would be complicity. So she made the call, not to the Pentagon, not yet, to a woman named Amara Temple, former Air Force pilot, now a civil rights attorney, with a voice sharp as steel and a resume that could rival a senator's. They hadn't spoken in 12 years, not since a messy strategic disagreement in Afghanistan. But Vivian knew she'd answer, and she did. Within 2 days, Amara had flown in. You want quiet reform or loud impact? She asked, as they sat in the kitchen where Vivian had once helped. Her mother makes sweet tea and cornbread. I want change, Vivian said, her voice steady. Then you're going to need both. The plan came together faster than anyone expected. Leveraging the viral video, the transcript evidence, and Vivian's now national profile, Amara assembled a coalition of former officers, activists, lawmakers, and faith leaders. But it wasn't about creating noise. It was about building weight. Every statistic had a name, every name had a story, and every story echoed the same cry. This system must answer for its patterns. By the end of the week, Vivian had agreed to speak publicly, not as a victim, not as a general, but as a daughter. She stood on the steps of her old high school where, decades earlier, her mother had taught civics to classrooms that rarely looked like her. The stage was simple, no flags, no fanfare, just her. The crowd wasn't massive, a few hundred in person, thousands more watching live online, but it wasn't the size that mattered. It was the silence when she spoke. I've served this country, in war zones and peace talks. I've carried the weight of decisions that changed lives and ended them. But nothing prepared me for what it felt like to have my dignity stripped on a quiet road, not by an enemy, but by someone who wears the same flag I do. The wind stirred, no one moved. I'm not here to punish, I'm not here to shame, I'm here to reveal, because if this can happen to me after 3 decades of service, 3 stars, and more medals than I ever asked for, then imagine how many it's happened to in silence. Imagine how many didn't have a camera nearby. Imagine how many didn't make it home. She paused, looking out at the faces before her. I don't want justice for me. I want change for all of us. That speech, simple, be quoted in classrooms, echoed in congressional hearings, and printed on signs from Georgia to California. But more than that, it would spark legislation. The Richardson Act, as it would later be called, proposed a nationwide review system for traffic stops involving veterans and uniformed personnel, alongside independent oversight of departments with repeated misconduct patterns. Vivian hadn't asked for the spotlight, but now that it had found her, she refused to waste it. In the days that followed, reporters flooded her inbox. Publishers offered book deals. Political parties whispered suggestions, but she declined all of it. She had no interest in fame. Instead, she returned to her mother's side. Elaine's breathing had grown more labored, but when Vivian shared the news that her story was moving mountains, her mother smiled for the first time in days. You used your voice, baby, she said, her voice little more than a breath. That's the greatest salute there is. Vivian didn't cry then, not until later, alone, because what Elaine had given her wasn't just life, it was legacy, and now, that legacy had been handed to the people. A week after her speech shook the quiet streets of Savannah, the ripple began to move like a slow building tide, quiet at first, then undeniable. Vivian wasn't chasing attention, but attention came anyway. The truth had a way of traveling fast, especially when it was wrapped in dignity and pain, honor and outrage. It started with a single clip. A local reporter had uploaded a short segment from her address, the part where Vivian stood tall and said, "If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." That line caught fire. Within 48 hours, it was circulating globally, translated into multiple languages, and replayed on evening news broadcasts in cities far from Georgia's red clay roads. And then came the letters, not emails, not tweets, actual handwritten letters, from veterans who had felt invisible, from widows who'd buried husbands with honorable discharges but dishonorable memories of how they'd been treated at home, from young cadets who said, "You made me believe there's a place for me in this uniform." Vivian read every one. She kept them in a shoebox by her mother's bedside. Her mother, still fighting, still holding on, insisted that she read them aloud in the afternoons. "That's the medicine," Elaine would say with a smile, even as her strength faded like a candle's final glow. But amid all the voices rising in support, one letter stood out. It was plain, almost stark in its presentation, no return address, no signature on the envelope. But when Vivian opened it, she stopped breathing for a moment. It was from Officer Karen Mitchell, the very woman who had handcuffed her on that roadside. The handwriting was careful, slow, deliberate, as if each word had been considered more than once. "General Richardson, there are no words that can undo what I did that day. No apology that can match the weight of your service, or the humiliation I caused. But I write this not for absolution. I write this because I've seen what happens when silence wins, and I've been silent far too long. I didn't recognize you that day, but the truth is, even if I had, I'm not sure I would have acted differently. That's the part that haunts me. I want to believe I'm better than that. I want to become better than that. I've started therapy. I've requested a reassignment. But more than anything, I want to understand. If you're willing, I'd like to meet, not in public, not for a headline, just as two women on different sides of a moment that shouldn't have happened. With whatever humility I have left, Karen Vivian read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and stared out the window. She'd faced enemies on the battlefield. She'd stood before world leaders, advised generals, and made decisions with lives in the balance. But this was different. This was intimate, messy, human. What did accountability really look like? What did redemption require? For days, she said nothing. Then one morning, as the sun crept through the blinds, casting golden lines across her mother's hospital blanket, Elaine whispered without opening her eyes, "You already know what to do. You've always known." So she replied. They met at an old cafe just outside of town. No cameras, no press, just two women, one wearing civilian clothes that didn't quite hide her military posture, and the other in jeans and a faded sheriff's department jacket that hung heavier than it used. The silence between them wasn't hostile. It was careful. Like walking barefoot over glass. Karen spoke first. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, eyes locked on the table, "but I needed to see you outside the uniform." Vivian nodded. "And I needed to see if you were ready to hear the truth." Over black coffee and biscuits, neither of them touched. They talked for hours. Karen told her about the culture she grew up in, about the unspoken rules she learned in her department, about the split-second decisions that became habits, and the biases she never questioned until they exploded in front of her. Vivian listened, not to excuse, but to understand. Then she spoke about her father, about West Point, about the day her stars felt heavier than her voice. She didn't soften the truth, she didn't dilute the pain, but she didn't weaponize it either. By the time they stood to leave, something had shifted. Karen looked her in the eyes and said, "If there's a way I can be part of fixing this, I'm asking for that chance." Vivian paused, then offered a small but firm nod. Change doesn't need perfection. It needs courage. Back in Washington, momentum was building. The Richardson Act had moved from whispers in committee halls to a fast-tracked vote. Veteran groups rallied behind it. Military leaders issued statements of support. And for the first time in years, it looked like bipartisan agreement might not be a dream. Vivian returned to D.C. under a different kind of mission. No longer just a soldier, now a symbol, but more importantly a voice for those whose stories had been erased or ignored. And just when she thought the road couldn't offer another twist, a phone call came. From the White House would she consider a new position, one that might redefine the way the nation trains, promotes, and protects its public servants. They weren't offering her a medal, they were offering her a mission. A soft knock on the hospital door interrupted the steady rhythm of machines and monitors. Vivian looked up from her chair beside her mother's bed, expecting a nurse, but instead found a tall man in a dark suit, holding a sealed envelope. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. The insignia on his lapel said everything. Elaine stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Vivian stood, careful not to show the surprise tightening in her chest. She took the envelope, thanked the messenger, and watched him disappear as quickly as he'd arrived. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored cardstock, embossed with a seal she knew well. It was an invitation, not ceremonial, not symbolic but strategic. The White House wanted her to lead a new federal commission tasked with rebuilding trust between communities and law enforcement, starting with deep reforms in how officers are recruited, trained, and held accountable. It wasn't a position, it was a promise. She sat back down, unsure whether to smile or sigh. Elaine turned her head, catching her daughter's hesitation. "Don't let the weight of it stop you," she whispered. "It's your voice they're asking for. Give it." Vivian didn't respond right away. She just held her mother's hand tighter. The next morning, Elaine passed quietly, her face peaceful. Her grip finally relaxed. Vivian stayed in Savannah for the funeral, modest by design, attended by dozens, but watched by thousands through a live stream that veterans and civilians alike shared around the world. The eulogy she delivered was not just about her mother. but about a legacy of grace under fire, of dignity unshaken by cruelty, and of strength so deep it didn't need to shout. Back in Washington, she stood alone at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Cameras clicked in the distance. A handful of aides stood nearby, waiting for the briefing. But in that moment, Vivian wasn't thinking about politics or policy. She was thinking about that little girl in the back seat of a car decades ago, watching her father being pulled out, remembering the helplessness, the silence. She took a breath and stepped forward into the spotlight, not as a victim, not as a hero, but as a bridge. The commission launched under her leadership just 2 months later. She refused the traditional fanfare. Instead, she opened the first meeting with a story not hers, but one she had received in a letter from a 19-year-old cadet who said, "I almost quit, but then I saw you stand back up." Under her guidance, the commission didn't just recommend changes, it piloted them. Community policing programs that embedded officers in neighborhoods before they ever wore a badge. Training modules that required emotional intelligence, cultural awareness, and crisis escalation as prerequisites. For graduation, transparency mandates that made bodycam footage public within 48 hours of any incident involving force. But perhaps the most impactful part of her work came from the least expected collaboration. Karen Mitchell, after their private meeting in Savannah, Karen had gone public with her own transformation, resigning from her post, then enrolling in a justice leadership program that Vivian quietly helped fund through a non-profit she started in her mother's name. Months later, they stood together on stage at a national policing symposium, Vivian in a tailored navy suit, Karen in civilian clothes, both women unflinchingly honest about the day their lives collided. The audience didn't cheer at first, they listened, and that silence filled with reflection instead of reaction was louder than applause. Over time, Vivian's work began to bear visible fruit. Cities across the country adopted new training standards based on the commission's framework. Recruitment brochures began to include cadets of every race, gender, and background, no longer as tokens but as leaders. And more officers began walking the beat, not with fear in their eyes, but with understanding in their step. Vivian declined offers for political office. She wasn't interested in headlines or elections. Her battlefield was systemic, her mission, lasting change. She did, however, accept one final honor presented in a quiet ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, where she laid a wreath, not for herself, but for her father, Marcus Richardson. The military had added a second plaque beside his, in honor of his daughter Lt. General Vivian Elaine Richardson, defender of peace, voice of justice. As she stepped back, her hand brushing the cold marble, she smiled. She had fulfilled the promise she made long ago to change the system from within, not with rage, not with revenge, but with resolve. The shoebox of letters now sits on her desk in her modest home office, each one a story, a seed of change. Every month, she adds a new one, a reminder that transformation doesn't come all at once. It arrives in moments, in choices, in people willing to speak when silence is easier. Her story wasn't just unforgettable, it was unfinished, because every voice she helped raise, every mind she helped open, every heart she helped reach, carried it forward. And maybe, just maybe, that little girl in the back seat all those years ago would finally feel seen, would finally feel safe, and would finally feel free.